Good morning. Thank you for joining us. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada is here today to provide its comments on the final safety investigation report into the downing of Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752. Our spokespeople are Kathy Fox, TSB Chair, Natasha Van Temsch, Director of Investigations, Air, who will be our French spokesperson, and Ewan Tasker, Manager of International Operations and Major Investigations, AIR, and TSB's appointed expert to the Iran investigation. Bonjour. Merci de vous joindre à nous ce matin. Le Bureau de la sécurité du transport du Canada est ici aujourd'hui pour formuler ses commentaires concernant le rapport final d'enquête sur le vol 752 de Ukraine International Airlines. Nos porte-paroles sont Kathy Fox, présidente du BST, Natasha Van Temsch, directrice des enquêtes du secteur aérien, Ewan Tasker, gestionnaire des opérations internationales et enquêtes majeures du secteur aérien et expert désigné du BST dans le cadre de l'enquête iranienne. We will be delivering remarks in English, followed by French. We will then be taking questions from the room and via teleconference. Les commentaires seront formulés d'abord en anglais, puis en français. Nous répondrons ensuite aux questions posées soit dans la salle ou par téléconférence.
Madam Fox.
Good morning. On January 8, 2020, Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was shot down shortly after taking off from Tehran's International Airport, killing all 176 people on board, including 55 Canadians, 30 permanent residents, and dozens of others with ties to Canada. Within a few short hours following this tragedy, the TSB advised Iran's Aircraft Accident Investigation Board, or AAIB, that we would appoint an expert in accordance with Annex 13 to the Convention on International Civil Aviation, and we accepted Iran's invitation to visit the accident site. From that day forward, we have been fully engaged in doing as much as possible to find out what happened, why it happened, and what needs to change to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Now, as a matter of practice, the TSB does not comment on reports from other agencies. However, given this unprecedented situation, where the state whose military was implicated in the event led the investigation, and given its impact within Canada, we feel that it is important to publicly convey our independent assessment of the final report. But before I discuss the contents of Iran's final investigation report, I'll speak briefly about the investigation process itself. First, I'd like to remind everyone that a safety investigation is not intended to attribute blame or determine civil or criminal liability. There are other processes that are better suited for that. Experience has shown that an independent and thorough safety-focused investigation usually offers the best chance of finding out what really happened and why, providing the answers that everyone is asking for, especially the families who lost so much. ICAO, Annex 13, prescribes the roles of participating countries, including which state has the right to lead the investigation and which other states may participate and to what extent. It should be noted that in the case of PS 752, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada had no jurisdiction to lead or conduct a parallel investigation. From the very beginning, Iran offered the TSB more access to the investigation activities than we were technically entitled to, but less than what we asked for. For example, 2 TSB investigators spent 6 days in Tehran following the crash, visiting the accident site, examining the wreckage, and meeting with Iranian safety investigators to review information gathered by their team. Later, they also met with Iranian, Ukrainian, and French investigators in Kiev before returning to Canada. In July of last year, our expert and a TSB recorder specialist attended the readout of the aircraft's flight recorders in Paris. Throughout the course of the investigation, we were in direct contact with Iran's AAIB and attended many discussions with the other participating countries. However, in spite of multiple requests, we were never formally accorded the higher status of accredited representative, and hence were not allowed to listen to the cockpit voice recorder or directly access the flight data recordings. At Ukraine's request in early February of this year, we were invited to provide them technical assistance, and Ukraine gave us access to the draft safety report for review and comments, something we would not otherwise have been entitled to. Throughout this process, we have specifically asked Iran's AAIB to answer three important questions. First, what was the sequence of events, including the technical, human, and organizational factors that led to the missiles being fired and the ultimate downing of PS-752? Second, what was the basis for the decision to keep Iran's airspace open during a period of heightened military alert after Iran had launched missiles into Iraq? And finally, why did civilian airlines continue to operate in Iran's airspace in the hours following Iran's launch of missiles into Iraq? In addition, we submitted dozens more detailed questions related to these three main lines of inquiry that we believe the final investigation report needed to address in order for it to be seen as thorough and credible. Since receiving Iran's draft investigation report, our team has carefully reviewed and analyzed its contents and has now compared it to the final report. And today we want to share our perspective, discussing how the report answers the three main questions. Iran's final report concludes that PS-752 was shot down because an air defense unit mistook the Boeing 737 as a threat. This misidentification reportedly occurred because of a misalignment of the missile launcher's radar. Furthermore, the operator did not receive permission to shoot from senior officers, as he should have. But to date, Iran has provided no evidence to support this scenario. However, it is a plausible explanation of what happened. The report does not provide detailed information regarding how the misalignment occurred, nor what steps were taken to ensure it was properly calibrated, nor anything about the missile operator's training, experience, or proficiency, nor about how or why the required communications with Central Military Command were either not followed or not successful. The report frames this action in the context of the heightened military alert, given their expectation of retaliation following Iran's earlier launch of missiles against Iraqi air bases housing U.S. military personnel. But it does not discuss what supervision or oversight was provided of field operations by Iran's military command and control. The AAIB says that military activities fall outside the scope of an Annex 13 investigation. We do not agree. Nor does the report discuss what steps the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has taken since then to identify the underlying safety deficiencies that allowed such an error to occur, nor what safety action has been taken to prevent such a mistake from happening again. Without this, how can the international civil aviation community be reassured that such a tragic error won't happen again? Iran's final report generally explains the risk assessment process and mitigations that its civilian authorities took in coordination with the military, given the uncertainty of a retaliatory strike following their launch of missiles into Iraq. For example, the report says that Iran gradually cleared air traffic from using certain air routes to the west, from which direction they thought a retaliatory strike might come, and required military approval for each individual aircraft's departure from civil airports such as Tehran's International Airport, including PS-752. However, Iran did not completely close its airspace to civilian aircraft. In spite of being in a state of heightened military alert, Iran did not publish any notices to warn aircraft operators of these hazards, as recommended by ICAO, until after PS-752 was shot down. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration did post a warning. However, this notice would not have been readily available to Ukraine International Airlines, nor other foreign operators outside of the U.S. Furthermore, Ukraine International Airlines was not the only airline to continue operating after Iran launched missiles against Iraq. In fact, 8 other aircraft departed Tehran before the shootdown of PS-752. The report only partially explains why the airspace remained open and why operators continued to fly after Iran had launched missiles into Iraq. It does not explain any of the underlying factors behind why the missiles were launched at PS-752, which is the stated cause of this accident. In short, the report says what happened, but it doesn't answer the why. The report indicates that some unspecified safety actions have since been taken by the military to reduce the risk of this happening again. However, the lack of details means we can't confirm that these actions will actually reduce the risks to civil aviation operations within Iran's airspace. Furthermore, although the AAIB has issued some recommendations, these don't specifically address the stated cause of this tragic event, which is the launching of the missiles. Now, we know this has been a very difficult time for the families, and in the end, no safety investigation report can bring back the lives of those who were lost. And so we must look at what has been learned and what can be done in the future to reduce the risk so that other families don't have to suffer through the same experience. We know that states will continue to engage in hostilities with other states or within their state. And in such a hostile environment, there will always be a risk to civilian aircraft, and innocent lives can be lost. It is the responsibility of the state to reduce these risks. So the best way to reduce the risk of such tragedies in the future is to firmly apply the lessons learned, first from the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, and now from this tragedy. More needs to be done to protect international civil aviation from operating in conflict zones. In a follow-up report to its investigation into the 2014 downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine, the Dutch Safety Board warned us, and I quote, "Practice shows that states in which there's an ongoing armed conflict will not implement restrictions for their airspace on their own initiative." Now, while ICAO has taken some action, it wasn't enough to prevent this occurrence. Transport Canada is now leading an initiative called Safer Skies to improve the safety of air travel worldwide by addressing gaps in the way the civil aviation sector deals with conflict zones. Such initiatives offer the best hope for the future to avoid another PS-752. In closing, I know much concern has been expressed about the international protocols that govern the conduct of these very unique types of safety investigations involving military activities, specifically the issue of the state of occurrence investigating itself. Additionally, when a state's accident investigation agency is not independent of the state aviation authority as required by ICAO, such as Iran's AIB, it can affect the credibility of the final report findings and the uptake of the resulting recommendations intended to prevent future accidents. Now that this safety investigation has concluded and Iran has issued its report, the TSB is committed to advocating for a review of the provisions of ICAO Annex 13 to improve the credibility and the transparency of such future safety investigations so that families and the public can have greater confidence in their findings and their recommendations. Thank you.
We will now deliver remarks in French before moving to the question period. La période de questions suivra l'allocution en français.
Question period will follow the French speech. Madame Van Temsch.
Le 8 janvier 2020, le vol
On January 8,
752
2020,
de Ukraine
International Airlines
a été abattu
Flight
peu après son
752 was
décollage de
shot down
l'aéroport
shortly after
international
taking
de
off from
Téhéran,
Tehran's
causant
international
la mort
airport,
des 176
killing all
personnes à bord,
176
dont
people on
55
board,
Canadiens,
including
30
55
résidents
Canadians,
permanents et des
30
dizaines
permanent
d'autres
residents
personnes ayant
and
des liens
dozens
avec
of
le
others
Canada.
with ties to Canada.
Quelques heures après cette tragédie,
Within a few short
le
hours
BST a
following this
avisé le bureau
tragedy,
d'enquête
the
sur les
TSB
accidents
advised
d'aéronefs de
Iran's
l'Iran, ou
Aircraft
le
Accident
AAIB, qu'il
Investigation Board,
nommerait
or
un
the
expert au terme de
AAIB,
l'annexe
that
13
we
à
would
la
appoint an
Convention
expert in
relative à
accordance with
l'aviation
Annex
civile
13
internationale.
to the Convention on International Civil
Et s'est
Aviation.
pleinement engagé à
And
faire
we
tout ce qui est
accepted
en son
Iran's
pouvoir
invitation
pour découvrir ce qui s'est
to
passé
visit
et
the
pourquoi.
accident site.
Le BST n'a pas coutume de commenter les rapports d'autres
As a matter of
organismes.
practice, the TSB
Toutefois,
does
il
not
s'agit
comment
d'une
on reports from
situation
other
inédite.
agencies. However, given this
Avant d'aborder le
unprecedented
contenu du rapport
situation,
d'enquête final de l'Iran,
before I
permettez-moi de parler brièvement
discuss
du
the
processus
contents of
d'enquête
Iran's
lui-même.
final investigation report, I
J'aimerais
will
d'abord
speak
rappeler
briefly
à
about
tous
the
qu'une enquête sur la
investigative
sécurité
process.
n'a pas
First,
pour but
I'd like
d'attribuer
to
de
remind
blâme
everyone that
ou
a
de
safety
déterminer les
investigation is not
responsabilités
intended to
civiles ou
attribute
pénales.
blame or determine civil or criminal
L'annexe
liability.
13 de l'OACI
ICAO
régit les rôles des
Annex
pays
13 prescribes
participants
the
et
roles
stipule,
of
entre autres, quel
participating
État a le
countries,
droit de mener
including which state
l'enquête
has the right to
et
lead the
stipule également
investigation,
quels autres
and which
États
other
peuvent
states may
participer à l'enquête
participate and to
et dans
what
quelle mesure.
extent.
Il convient de noter que dans le cas
It
de
should be
l'enquête sur le
noted that
vol
in the case of PS
752, le
752,
BST
the
n'avait
Transportation
aucune autorité
Safety
pour mener
Board
une
had no
enquête
jurisdiction
parallèle.
to lead or conduct a parallel
Tout au long de ce
investigation.
processus, nous avons
From the
demandé
very beginning,
expressément à l'AAIB de répondre à 3 questions
we asked
importantes.
the AAIB
Premièrement,
to answer
quelle
3
était la
important
chronologie des
questions.
événements,
First of all,
notamment
what was the
quels étaient les facteurs
chronology
techniques,
of
humains
events,
et
including technical,
organisationnels
human,
qui ont
and
mené au
organizational
lancement des
factors that
missiles
led to the
qui
missiles
ont
being fired
abattu
and
le vol
ultimately the
PS-752.
downing of PS 752.
Ensuite, sur quelle base
Next,
a-t-on pris la
what was the
décision
basis for
de
the
laisser
decision to
l'espace
keep
aérien
Iran's
iranien
airspace
ouvert
open
pendant une
during a
période
period of
d'alerte
heightened
militaire
military
après
alert
que l'Iran
after
eut
Iran
lancé ses
had
missiles vers
launched
l'Irak?
missiles into Iraq?
Et finalement,
And
pourquoi les transporteurs aériens
why did
civils
civil
ont-ils
airlines
poursuivi
continue to
leurs activités
operate
dans
in Iran's
l'espace aérien
airspace
iranien au
in
cours
the
des
hours
heures qui ont
following
suivi le
Iran's
lancement des
launch
missiles
of
vers l'Irak?
missiles into Iraq?
Également, nous avons présenté
In
en rapport à
addition,
ces 3 champs d'enquête principaux des dizaines de questions plus
we
détaillées
submitted dozens
que le
of more
rapport
detailed
d'enquête
questions
final
related
devait
to these
aborder
3
selon
main
nous
lines
pour
of
être perçu
inquiry
comme étant un
that we
rapport
believe the final
minutieux et
report needed to
crédible.
address in order for it to be seen as
Depuis que
thorough
le
and
BST a
credible.
reçu l'ébauche du rapport d'enquête,
Since
notre équipe a
receiving Iran's draft
soigneusement étudié
investigation
et
report,
analysé
our
son
team has
contenu
carefully
et
reviewed
l'a
and
maintenant
analyzed its
comparé avec le
contents and
contenu
has
du
now
rapport
compared it
final.
to the final report.
Aujourd'hui, nous voulons
Today, we
présenter
want to
notre
share
point
our
de vue sur la
perspective
façon dont le
discussing
rapport répond
how
aux
the
3
report
questions
answers the 3
principales.
main questions.
Le rapport final de l'Iran conclut que le vol
Iran's final report concludes
PS-752
that
a été abattu
PS-752
parce qu'une
was
unité
shot
de
down
défense
because an
aérienne
air
a pris
defense
l'avion
unit
pour une menace.
mistook the
Cette erreur aurait
B-737
été
aircraft as
causée
a threat.
par un mauvais alignement du radar du
And
lance-missile.
this misidentification
De plus,
reportedly occurred because of
l'opérateur
a
n'avait pas
misalignment of
reçu
the missile
des
launcher's
officiers
radar.
supérieurs
Furthermore, the operator
l'autorisation
did
de
not
tirer
receive permission to
comme
shoot
il l'aurait
from
dû.
senior officers as he should
Jusqu'à
have.
maintenant, l'Iran n'a
To date,
produit
Iran
aucune
has
preuve
provided no
pour appuyer
evidence
ce
to
scénario.
support this scenario.
Il s'agit toutefois d'une
However,
explication
it
plausible
is a
de ce qui s'est
plausible
produit.
explanation for what happened.
Le rapport ne fournit pas
The
d'informations
report does not provide
détaillées sur
detailed
la façon
information
dont le
regarding
mauvais
how
alignement
the
s'est produit
misalignment occurred,
et les mesures
nor
prises
what
pour
steps were
s'assurer qu'il
taken
est
to
convenablement
ensure it
calibré.
was properly calibrated.
Sur la formation,
The missile
l'expérience et la
operator's
compétence de
training,
l'opérateur du
experience,
lance-missile,
or
ou sur les
proficiency,
raisons ou les manières dont
or
les communications
about how
requises
or
avec le
why the
commandement
required
central
communications with Central
n'ont pas
Command
été
were either not
respectées ou n'ont
followed
pas été
or were
effectuées.
unsuccessful.
Le rapport présente cette
The
action
report frames
dans le
this action
contexte
in the
d'un
context of the
état
heightened
d'alerte militaire
military
accru,
alert,
mais
given
n'aborde pas la
their
question de la
expectation
supervision des
of
opérations sur le
retaliation
terrain.
following Iran's
Le
earlier launch of
AAIB dit que les
missiles
activités
against
militaires
the Iraqi
n'entrent
base,
pas
but
dans
it
la
does not
portée d'une
discuss what
enquête
supervision or
en vertu de
oversight was
l'annexe 13,
provided.
mais nous ne sommes pas d'accord.
The AAIB says the activities fall
Le
outside of the
rapport
scope of
n'aborde
an
pas
Annex
non
13
plus les
investigation.
mesures
We do
prises
not
par le
agree.
corps des gardiens
Nor
de la
does the report
Révolution
discuss what
islamique
steps the
depuis
Islamic
l'événement
Revolutionary Guard Corps
pour
has taken
cerner les
since then
lacunes
to
de sécurité
identify the underlying
sous-jacentes
safety
qui ont
deficiencies
engendré une
that
telle
allowed
erreur,
such an error
ni
to
les
occur,
mesures de sécurité
nor
qui ont
what
été
safety
prises
action
pour
has been
empêcher
taken
qu'une telle
to
erreur se
prevent such a
reproduise.
mistake from happening again.
Sans cette information,
Without this,
comment le milieu
how
de
can the
l'aviation civile
international civil
internationale
aviation
peut-il
community
être assuré
be
qu'une erreur
reassured that
aussi
such a
tragique
tragic error
ne puisse se reproduire?
won't happen again?
Le rapport final de l'Iran explique en termes
Iran's final
généraux
report generally
le
explains
processus
the risk
d'évaluation
assessment
du risque et les
process
mesures
and
d'atténuation
mitigations
des
that its
risques
civil
prises par
authorities,
ces autorités
civilian
civiles en
authorities rather, took
coordination
in
avec les autorités
coordination with the
militaires.
military.
Par exemple, le
For
rapport
example,
mentionne que
the
l'Iran
report says
a
that Iran
graduellement
gradually cleared
empêché
air
le trafic
traffic
aérien
from
d'emprunter
using
certaines route
certain
aérienne vers
air routes
l'ouest,
to the west,
croyant que c'est de cette
from
direction
which
qu'une
direction
frappe
they
des
thought a
représailles viendrait.
retaliatory strike might
Toutefois, l'Iran
come.
n'a pas complètement fermé son
However, Iran
espace
did not
aérien aux
completely close its
aéronefs civiles.
airspace to civilian aircraft.
Même si elle se trouvait dans un état d'alerte militaire
In spite of
accru,
being in a state of
l'Iran
heightened
n'a pas
military
publié
alert,
d'avis
Iran did not
pour
publish any
mettre en garde les
notices to
exploitants
warn
aériens
aircraft
contre ces
operators
dangers,
of these
comme le
hazards,
recommande
as
l'OACI,
recommended by
avant que le
ICAO,
vol PS
until after
752 soit
PS
abattu.
752 was shut down.
La Federal Aviation
The U.S.
Administration
Federal
des États-Unis
Aviation
avait,
Administration
elle,
did
publié un
post a
avis.
warning.
Toutefois, cet avis
However, this
n'était pas
notice
facilement
would not have
accessible
been
pour
readily
Ukraine International
available to
Airlines
Ukraine
ou
International
par d'autres
Airlines,
exploitants
nor
étrangers
to any
hors des
other foreign
États-Unis.
operators outside of the
Par ailleurs,
U.S.
Ukraine
Furthermore,
International
Ukraine
Airlines n'était
International
pas le seul
Airlines
transporteur
was not the
aérien à poursuivre
only
ses
airline to
activités
continue
après que
operating
l'Iran
after
eut
Iran
lancé
launched
des missiles
missiles
vers
against
l'Irak.
Iraq.
8 autres vols ont quitté
8 other
Téhéran
aircraft
après que le vol
departed Tehran
PS-752
before
soit
the
averti.
shoot-down of
Ce rapport
PS-752.
n'explique qu'en partie
This
pourquoi
report only
l'espace
partially
aérien est
explains
resté
why the
ouvert et
airspace
pourquoi
remained
les
open and
exploitants
why
ont
operators
poursuivi leurs
continued
activités
to
après que
fly
l'Iran eut
after
lancé
Iran
des
had
missiles vers
launched
l'Irak.
missiles into Iraq.
Il n'explique
It
aucun
does not
des facteurs
explain any
sous-jacents
of
à
the
l'origine
underlying
du lancement
factors
des
behind
missiles
why the
vers le
missiles
vol
were launched at
PS-752, la cause
PS-752,
déclarée de cette
the
tragédie.
stated cause of
En
this
bref, le
tragedy.
rapport
In
indique ce
short,
qui
the
s'est
report
produit,
says
mais
what
n'explique pas
happened,
pourquoi
but it
cet
doesn't
événement
explain
s'est
the
produit.
why.
Nous savons que ça a été très
We
difficile à
know that
vivre
this
pour les
has been
familles.
very difficult
En
for the
fin de compte,
families.
aucun rapport
In the
d'enquête sur
end,
la
no
sécurité ne
safety
pourra jamais
investigation
rendre
report
les
can
vies
ever
perdues.
bring back those who
Nous
were
devons donc
lost.
compter sur ce
And
que
so
nous
we
avons
must look
appris
to what has
et
been
sur ce que
learned
nous pouvons
and
faire
what
pour
can be
réduire les
done
risques,
to reduce the
afin
risks
que
so that
d'autres
other
familles
families
n'aient
don't
à
have to
souffrir,
suffer through
afin
this
qu'aucune autre
in
famille
the
n'ait à souffrir
future.
de la sorte dans l'avenir. Il y a plus à faire pour prévenir les activités de
More needs
l'aviation
to be
civile
done to
internationale
protect
dans les zones de
international
conflit.
civil aviation from
Transport Canada
operating in
dirige
conflict
actuellement une
zones. In a
initiative sur la
follow-up
sécurité
report to its
aérienne,
investigation into the
l'initiative pour des
2014
ciels
downing
plus
of
sûrs,
Malaysia Airlines
visant à
Flight
améliorer la sécurité
17.
du transport aérien
We
dans le monde entier
We are
en
working
comblant les
on an
lacunes
initiative
dans
Safer
la manière
Skies
dont le
to
secteur de
improve
l'aviation
the
civile
safety of
traite
air
les
travel
zones de
worldwide
conflit.
by addressing gaps in the
Les
way civil
initiatives
aviation
de ce type
sector
constituent notre
deals with
meilleur espoir
conflict
pour éviter
zones.
un autre
Such initiatives offer the best
PS-752.
hope for the future to avoid another
En terminant,
PS-752.
je
In
sais que de
closing,
nombreuses
I know much
préoccupations
concern
ont été
has been
soulevées en ce
expressed
qui
about the
concerne les
international
protocoles
protocols that
internationaux
govern the
qui
conduct of
régissent
these very
l'exécution de ces
unique
enquêtes
types
très
of
particulières
safety
touchant des activités
investigations
militaires, en
involving
particulier le
military
fait que l'État
activities,
d'occurrence mène une
specifically
enquête
the
sur
issue
lui-même.
of the state of occurrence
En outre,
investigating itself.
lorsque l'organisme d'enquête sur
Additionally,
les
when a
accidents d'un
state's
État
accident
n'est pas
investigation agency
indépendant
is
de
not
l'Autorité
independent
nationale
of the State
d'aviation
Aviation
civile,
Authority
conformément aux
as required
exigences
by
de
ICAO,
l'OACI, et comme c'est le cas pour le
such
AAIB,
as is the
ceci
case
peut
for
nuire à
Iran's
la
AAIB,
crédibilité des
it can
constatations du
affect the
rapport final
credibility of the
et à
final report
l'adoption des
findings and the
recommandations
uptake of
qui s'en
resulting
découlent.
recommendations intended to
Maintenant que
produce
cette enquête sur la
prevent
sécurité est terminée,
future
le BST est
accidents.
résolu
Now that
à
this
faire la
safety
promotion d'un
investigation has
examen des
concluded, the
dispositions de
TSB is
l'annexe
committed
13
to
de
advocating
l'OACI
for a review
en
of the
vue
provisions of
d'améliorer la
ICAO Annex
crédibilité et la
13 to
transparence des
improve the
futures enquêtes de
credibility and
sécurité de ce
transparency
type
of such future
afin que les
safety
familles touchées
investigations so
et
that
le
families
public
and the public
puissent avoir
can have
confiance
confidence in their findings
en leurs constatations et en leurs
and
recommandations.
recommendations.
Merci.
Thank you.
We will now start the question period. Please ask one question and one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant débuter la
We will
période
now
de
start the question
questions.
period.
Veuillez
You may
poser
ask
une
one
question et
question
une
and
question
one
suivie.
follow-up.
Please identify yourself before asking your question. Veuillez vous identifier avant de
Please
poser votre
identify
question.
yourself before asking your question.
Operator, could we have a first question on the phone, please?
Thank you. Merci. If you have a question and you're using a speakerphone, please lift your handset before making your selection. Si vous utilisez un téléphone main libre, s'il vous plaît, soulevez le combiné avant d'effectuer votre sélection. If you have a question, please press star 1 on your device's keypad. Si vous désirez poser une question, puis s'il vous plaît, appuyez sur les touches étoile 1 de votre appareil. The first question is from Ashley Burke from CBC News. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi, Chair Fox. Thanks for taking my question. Ukraine's foreign minister said yesterday in a video, he called this report, quote, a cynical attempt to hide true causes of the downing, and said it was nothing but a collection of manipulations aimed at not establishing truth, but acquitting Iran. In your own words, how would you describe this report?
We believe that the final report issued by Iran yesterday is incomplete. It raises more questions than it answers. It does provide some basic information about the factors that led to the military shootdown of PS-752, but it falls short of answering many of the detailed questions of the underlying factors that cause that. It briefly describes the risk assessment process, but it doesn't really go into the details about why, for example, they allowed aircraft to continue operating even though there was a threat of a retaliatory strike. and it doesn't really go into the details about why the aircraft was, or why it didn't issue NOTAMs until after PS752 was shot down. So overall, we believe it does provide some information, but definitely it leaves more questions unanswered.
And I understand the TSB had a technical advisor work with Ukraine and saw this draft report. Ukraine said that they submitted 90 pages of remarks and proposals, but it wasn't actioned. I'm curious if, obviously, I'm assuming that would have also included Canada's input as well. And I'm also just curious what your feelings are after 15 months. Your team's been searching for answers. What it feels like to get this report that you say is incomplete.
I'm going to ask Mr. Tasker to address that question because he was our appointed expert who, until now, we have not publicly identified, and he can give you a more direct answer. So,
thanks. So, in the process of the draft review advising the Ukraine accredited representative, we submitted our comments to them, which were then included with Ukraine's comments within that 90-page amount. We submitted approximately 120 questions. Or concerns of our own. Some of those were addressed in the report and some were not. As per Annex 13, for the submissions that are not addressed, the AIB that is running the report or doing the report has to either make the changes or pen the comments in the end. So you'll see in the appendices of this final report, there are many comments listed as from the Ukraine that have been penned with an explanation. Ours are included in that list as well. From approximately 57 onwards, there's approximately 48, I believe, of our comments that are left unanswered. And even reviewing further, looking back at the, say, 60 or so that are not penned, some of those as well we're concerned with don't seem to have amendments or changes reflected to them. So we did have many questions, and unfortunately many of them left unanswered.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Marie-Hélène Rattel à Radio-Canada.
Marie-Hélène Rattel, Radio-Canada.
Oui,
question.
bonjour. Je demanderais de résumer ça un peu en français. Dans un premier temps, comment est-ce que vous avez reçu ce rapport? Qu'est-ce qui était le plus frustrant et décevant pour vous là-dedans?
Disappointing for you in it?
Donc,
Answer.
OK, pour ce qui est de ce que M. Tasker a mentionné au niveau des commentaires qu'on a donnés, on a été nommé comme, à la demande de l'Ukraine, comme conseiller pour l'Ukraine, conseiller technique. Ça nous a permis, en fait, de réviser l'ébauche du rapport et de soumettre tous nos commentaires et questions qu'on avait au sujet de son contenu. Ça a été fait, ça a été envoyé à l'Ukraine, qui ont fait une soumission au AIB iranien. De toutes les questions qu'on a et commentaires qu'on a soumis, il y en a certaines qui ont été adressées, mais pas l'ensemble de ce qu'on a demandé. Puis le processus, en fait, c'est quand ça, c'est pas fait, l'équipe d'enquête, l'autorité d'enquête doit attacher en annexe les commentaires qui n'ont pas été adressés. Vous allez voir dans le rapport final, en fait, c'est l'annexe B. Vous allez voir tous les commentaires qui n'ont pas été adressés dans le rapport sont listés à cet endroit-là. Pour ce qui est du commentaire général sur le rapport, comme Mme Fox a mentionné, le rapport pour nous est incomplet. Ce rapport-là, il soulève beaucoup plus de questions
more questions than it provides answers, unfortunately.
Fait que c'est ça, c'est incomplet, puis malheureusement, le rapport se focus beaucoup sur qu'est-ce qui s'est passé, mais what happened,
but does not explain
why
it happened. And the why is the most important part for prevention in the measures taken to prevent an incident like this from happening in the future.
Quels sont vos recours pour la suite des choses? Parce que je comprends que
I understand that you are very limited in what you can do, but for the families of the victims, for the government as well, it's insufficient. So is there any other recourse to obtain more answers to our questions? Answer. I will answer. Now that the security investigation is complete,
Nous, en tant que BST,
we at the TSB cannot do anything further other than what we mentioned. We will pursue change to the international protocol, but we know that the Government of Canada has said even yesterday through an announcement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Transportation that they will continue to pursue it. But the recourse available to them, I cannot weigh in on that. It is up to them to do so. But I think they are committed to finding answers through other means in the coming days, weeks, and months.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Kevin Gallagher, CTV News. Your line is open.
Thank you. My question is for Ms. Fox. I just want you to elaborate a bit more on your difference of opinion of the type of investigation that you could launch in terms of Iran's military. Obviously, there's a lack of cooperation, it seems, a lack of evidence, you say, is provided. Is there any precedent? You said that there's a difference of opinion in how deep that investigation could go into, a country's military in a situation like this. Is there any precedent like this before? Was this totally unprecedented to try and get that type of information from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? And also, the evidence, obviously, that you say isn't provided. Could that have been provided easily in another context?
When we, the TSB, launched an investigation into an occurrence, everything is on the table. Nothing is out of scope. We pursue different lines of inquiry until we determine that they weren't a factor, and then we may stop. We believe that this investigation needed to look into the military activities that led to their stated cause, which was a misalignment, a misidentification, a miscommunication, a breakdown in procedures to support that scenario, which they haven't done. I acknowledge that it would be very challenging for any state to investigate its own military activities in such a case. But I think it's important for public confidence in the findings of the report to delve into those areas so that there can be confidence that if it was in fact an error, it won't happen again. Now, there have been previous shoot downs. There was a shoot down of Korean Airlines back in the early 80s over Russia. There was the shoot down of an Iranian airliner by the U.S. By a U.S. aircraft carrier in the late 80s, and those were investigated, and those reports are probably available online. So we don't accept the premise that you can't delve into the military side to identify what happened. And Iran has the best form, we think, would have been through the safety investigation. Now, they haven't done that, so it remains to be seen what other information they will provide in the future, or what other recourses nations have to try and obtain that information, obtain the accountability and the justice that the countries and the families are seeking and deserve.
As a follow-up, was there clear evidence from the Iranian military trying to obfuscate, trying to, shelter investigators from, a certain path of questions or investigations? Was there a clear rejection, for example, of specific documents that TSB investigators felt would have been valuable to the investigation?
Well, like Kathy mentioned, when the TSB investigates, everything is on the table. So we will continue going down any road we think may lead to some sort of safety benefit or some lesson learned. In the case of Iran, it was clear early on in this investigation that they didn't intend to go too deep down into the military side of the investigation. And so although I didn't see evidence of obscuration or individual investigators being held back, it's the environment they're operating in. So once they've made that decision to not include the military in the scope, then that becomes a team decision, and then the whole investigating body does not go down there. And so whether you call that obscuration or whether you call that a limiting of scope due to their lack of independence is a question. But I saw no direct evidence of any sort of malfeasance or obscuration.
We will now take a question in the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre une question dans la salle.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for taking our question. My name is Man Hamidi. I'm with the Canadian Press. Can you explain why military activities would be captured by ICAO rules and what these activities might tell us about what happened on January 8th?
Right, so it may seem to some that military activities would be outside of an Annex 13 investigation, but I can show you where they aren't. So in a case like this, Iran's own report says that the threat, the reason the airspace was kept open was that the threat was unknown or a previously understood or unknown threat of the possible mistake or incorrect launching of a surface missile. Now, in the future, for civil aviation bodies such as the regulator or the operator to do their risk assessments and make decisions based on these threats, they have to understand the threat. Because if they don't understand the threat, they can't make an accurate risk assessment to address it. So airspaces will remain open and operators will continue to fly if they don't understand that threat. So although it seems on the periphery, understanding the underlying factors behind it need to be understood to truly understand the threat.
Thank you. As a follow-up, you say the lack of detail in the report means that TSB can't confirm these actions will reduce risks to airlines in Iran's airspace. What should Canadians and airlines operating in Iran take from this? Is it like don't fly to Iran or something else?
What we're saying is not that there weren't actions taken, but the report says with respect to the military activities, the military has taken action to address the risk, but we don't know what actions they've taken. And therefore, how can the public, how can the civil aviation, international civil aviation community have confidence that whatever led to this particular shoot down won't happen again? And that's why we believe it would have been beneficial, not just to answer to the families what happened, but also to reassure the public and the international aviation community that action has been taken and the risks have been reduced. They have made some recommendations with respect, for example, to earlier publication of notices to airmen, with respect to oversight of risk assessments, but without knowing what happened on the military side and what actions they've taken, I think there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered.
Like people need to know, should they fly to Iran or not? Is it safe? Do you think like they should be hesitant to fly there because there is no enough safety procedures?
We're not in a position to say because we don't know what actions have been taken. So I think the important thing is that Transport Canada now is working with the international community through its Safer Skies initiative to learn from this accident, from this tragedy, and from others, what additional steps the international community has to take to ensure that civil aircraft, aren't exposed to risk if they're operating in hostile areas, and that there's a broader sharing of intelligence information regarding emerging risks so that airlines are in a better position to make their own risk assessment, regardless of what a particular state decides to do.
We will now go back to the phone. Nous allons maintenant retourner au téléphone. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Alison Lampert from Reuters. Your line is open.
Thank you. We understand Canada is doing some type of forensic report or investigation. Do you know what this is about? Is TSB part of it? And how much information could Canada get, given, as you mentioned, the country is not credited by U.S. Ukraine under Annex 13?
I'm sorry that, Alison, you were breaking up there. So I only understood part of your question. I don't know if you can repeat it again, please.
Sure. So we understand Canada is doing some type of forensic report or investigation. What does that involve? Have you heard of this? Is the TSB a part of it? And how much information could Canada get, given, as you mentioned, that Canada is not accredited like the U.S. or Ukraine under Annex 13?
Okay, thank you. Yes, we're aware that there is a forensic team that is conducting its own investigation. We're not part of that team. In fact, we did not share any information during the ongoing investigation with them or with anybody else because we were restricted from doing so under ICAO Annex 13. I believe that they intend to complete their investigation and release a report in the near future, but really you would have to ask the other government departments that are involved as to that particular investigation.
Okay, so just as a follow-up, you talked in your opening remarks about reviewing provisions of ICAO's Annex 13. So would you want the Annex, some of the provisions changed so that countries could not lead investigations if their militaries were involved, sort of like a model like what happened in MH17? Or what would you want to see changed?
The Annex 13 protocols have worked very, very well over many, many years in terms of multinational cooperation in foreign aviation investigations in your more typical type of aircraft accident, one caused by human error, mechanical error, weather, etc. But I think this most recent event and investigation demonstrates that it has limitations. Now, it's very clear under ICAO, under the ICAO Convention, that states have sovereignty over their airspace and over the conduct of investigations. So what we would like to see are changes to Annex 13 that would facilitate more transparency and independence in the case, these unique cases where a state's military has been involved in bringing down a civilian airliner. And that might take many forms. It could be, for example, delegation, which is what Ukraine did in 2014 when an aircraft was shot down while transiting their airspace, and they delegated to the Dutch Safety Board, who produced a very thorough investigation report. It could be having independent observers, third-party observers as part of it. It could take many forms, but our belief is that the experts at ICAO should talk about this and look at, what have we learned from this and other investigations, and what can be done to improve Annex 13, specifically so that it fulfills its purpose, which is to get to the underlying factors so that actions can be taken, concrete actions, to prevent future accidents. Now, I will add that Ewan Tasker is the Canadian representative to the Accident Investigation Group at ICAO, and so we will be pursuing, hopefully, those types of discussions with our international colleagues in the coming weeks and months.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question. Éric Pierre Champagne, La Presse.
Éric Pierre Champagne, La Presse. Question.
Oui, bonjour. En fait,
yes,
ce que je comprends, je ne veux pas vous mettre des mots dans la bouche. Bon, ce que vous dites, l'analyse que vous faites du rapport de l'Iran, c'est que dans une situation similaire, qui ne se passe pas déjà à nouveau, il n'y a rien qui garantit qu'on ne se retrouverait pas avec le même résultat.
That would prevent you from achieving the same result.
Because you're saying, on sait ce qui s'est passé, le rapport nous dit ce qui s'est passé, mais on ne semble pas avoir pointé les éléments qui permettent d'expliquer pourquoi ça s'est passé, puis ensuite d'apporter les correctifs. Est-ce que c'est pas un peu ça? Il n'y a pas un risque dans des circonstances similaires, un incident similaire se reproduise.
A similar incident could occur.
C'est difficile à dire parce qu'en fait,
it's difficult to say because what the
report
didn't do was give details.
Par exemple,
it says, for example, on the military level, they'll say that actions were taken, but they don't tell us exactly what they were. So it's difficult to comment on a future event and what could happen, given that we don't have those details. And that's what's unfortunate in this investigation, is that these details are important not only for Iran but the international community. To learn from this situation, we need to have the details. Without the details, we can't conduct good prevention measures. Thank you.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Jason Magder, Montreal Gazette. The line is open.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my question. The families issued a statement yesterday, basically casting many of the same questions you were casting today, but it seems that they're also saying that it seems to have been a intentional military action. Is there anything that the investigator saw, anything that the independent investigator saw on the Canadian side to support this? Is there any evidence that you have seen that was troubling that was not included in the final report?
So that's a difficult question. The final report, as you know, as we've mentioned, in the area of the explanation behind why the missile was launched is very thin. We're provided with a few explanations to do with the miscalibration, some miscommunication, lack of procedure, misidentification. But the underlying factors behind each of those, the why behind each of those, is left unexplained or unknown. So we don't have a lot of information. Being part of the investigation process, I also wasn't given any of that information at any point. So I haven't seen anything that's missing, but I realize there are many things beneath the surface that aren't in the report and unfortunately weren't shared with me.
Okay, and the Transportation Safety Board, as well as the families, have been asking for audio, the audio of the cockpit recordings, as well as other pieces of evidence that were not included in the final report. Is there any way to pressure Iran? Are there any avenues that can be taken to get this information after the release, either through ICAO or through any other international bodies to shed more light on this?
At the tail end of that question, your audio died down. Can you perhaps repeat the part after getting access to the cockpit voice recorder?
Sorry, is there any way to get to pressure Iran to get access to the voice recording, either through any international bodies? Essentially, is there any way to? Are there any? What's the next step that can be done once now it's concluded that the report still has many questions that remain?
Right. So there are many different rules and restrictions with cockpit voice recorders. Some of those laid out by ICAO Annex 13, and then some different in each country. For example, Canada is very protective of cockpit voice recordings. We will not release them. That may be different in other countries. In the case for us, in this investigation, because we were not accredited representatives, we were not allowed to hear the cockpit voice recording. The other accredited representatives were, unfortunately. Not unfortunately, that's fortunate for them, I should say. It's unfortunate that we did not get to. In terms of next of kin associations or others getting access to that cockpit voice recording in the future, it's a bit out of our scope, or not our scope, but the TSB's or role, I should say, in the sense that we're playing within that safety investigation rules, our own rules, the protection of that CVR and Annex 13. So there's no direct way really for us to push to get to it. Whether there is or not from a judicial perspective or some sort of other perspective, I think is a question better for those organizations. Was that the tail end of the question? I seem to remember something else at the end. Can you remind me?
No, that was basically it was what the next steps could be to try to pressure for these recordings to be released, essentially.
I will just add, again, in terms of our participation in the safety investigation, because Iran has issued its final report, our role essentially ends there. However, we do have, and we will pursue proposed changes to ICAO Annex 13. But again, I think the government of Canada has made it very clear that even if this report has been issued and the safety investigation is concluded, that doesn't end the quest for answers. And in fact, the government has perhaps other options, other recourses that it's considering, but it's really up to those departments to speak to that. We can't speak to that at this time.
Thank you.
Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, André Ducharme, TVA Nouvelle. À vous.
Question.
Oui, bonjour. J'aimerais que vous reveniez en français sur le fait que l'enquête est incomplète parce qu'on ne parle pas du tout du rôle des gardiens de la Révolution. Est-ce que vous pouvez élaborer là-dessus, s'il vous plaît?
Revolutionary Guard. Could you speak to that, please?
L'enquête est incomplète
The investigation is incomplete
qu'est-ce qui est écrit à ce niveau-là, au niveau de tout ce qui s'est passé du moment que les missiles se sont lancés, tout ce qui s'est passé dans l'arrière-plan du côté militaire. Il le mentionne, il dit qu'est-ce qui est arrivé, mais il dit pas, par exemple, pourquoi c'est arrivé. C'est là qu'on trouve, c'est pour ça qu'on trouve que le rapport est incomplet. Comme par exemple, je vais vous donner certains exemples. On a l'impression souvent que le côté militaire, on ne peut pas parler de ça, c'est secret, mais il y a certaines choses
talk about it, it's secret,
but there are some things that even under the auspices of an Annex
13 investigation, we should be able to get those answers. If you look at the operator, what was the training of the missile operator? What were their skills? And then why did communications fail with the superiors of the missile operator? They weren't able to communicate. All of those types of details should be part of the report, because that is what will allow us to understand truly what happened and to take the necessary measures in the future so that it never occurs again.
Merci. En sous-question, alors j'aimerais savoir,
Thank you. Follow-up.
I'd like to know, you seem to
count on ICAO to ensure that there are better mechanisms in place to avoid keeping airspace open in conflict zones. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Answer. What we're asking from ICAO is, well, in the event of cases like this one, of PS 752, where
en contexte, on a présentement un pays qui abat un avion, mais qui est permis ensuite d'enquêter sur cet événement-là.
Shot down the aircraft, but then conducted an investigation. It could create a conflict of interest. It is a real conflict of interest.
Perçu.
Or perceived one as well. It causes problems with the credibility of the investigation. So that is what we need to improve with the ICAO. We have drawn it to their attention because the credibility of the report is important so that people can adopt the messages that come out of the report and adopt the measures so that they prevent this type of accident in the future. So I also thought it concerned the fact that you're keeping airspace open when there were risks because there was a threat of conflict or conflict underway. It had nothing to do with the conflict. Answer. What I think you're referring to is perhaps the initiative by TSB, Safer Skies. That is a collaboration between a number of countries for exchanging information to ensure that the information available around the world on conflict zones is shared quickly
la communauté de l'aviation.
Through the aviation community, so that people can take informed decisions and make risk assessments, whether they will go to country X or not. That information is currently not always well transmitted, and that is what the Transport Canada initiative is trying to target, and it's a very good initiative. Thank you.
Operator, next question on the phone, please.
Thank you. Merci. Once again, please press *1 on the device's keypad if you have a question. N'hésitez pas à faire étoile 1 pour toute question sur votre appareil. There are no further questions on the telephone. Il n'y a plus de questions au téléphone. De retour à vous. Back to you.
This concludes the press conference. Thank you. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.
This concludes the press conference. Thank you.